Well, I am a pastor's son. My dad's now deceased, but he was a minister, and we basically served churches in the Midwest, Wichita, Kansas, St. Louis, Missouri, and then later the Chicago area. So therefore I grew up in a parsonage, and our church life was quite extensive, obviously, because of that. And I grew up obviously as a Christian. I mean, when you grow up in a pastor's home, I don't think you're ever allowed to say you're not a Christian. So I remember more accepting Christ, in my own heart when I was like 16 at a Fellowship of Christian Athletes camp. But prior to that, I had certainly been a Sunday school person, a vacation Bible school person, the whole 9 yards. When I was small, there was some sexual abuse that happened, in my home, and that's a very early part of my experience. And I think that the confusing part of that was that, growing up in a religious home, in a Christian home, with all the messages of the Bible being taught, daily, to have that kind of sexual experience was also really confusing. It wasn't a heinous experience. It wasn't awful. It wasn't, by that I mean it wasn't frightening or anything like that. It just happened. And I think because it was so much just a part of normal daily life that it occurred at bedtime when I was going to bed, it really confused me a lot about sexuality. As we say in the series, the sexual arousal template, for me it happened when I was like 3 years old. So, at that age, developmentally, you really have no ability to process that in a healthy way. And that was the case for me. So, even as a 3, 4, 5-year-old, I can recall being on fire. I mean, that's even the words that I would have used for myself, with thoughts that were in fact sexual thoughts. I wouldn't have known even the word sex back then, but I was preoccupied with, women's bodies and wanting to see them naked, and, I hadn't even been to school yet. So then when I got to school, we're supposed to go through that phase where we hate girls. Well, that was never the case for me. I mean, I always preferred girls and preoccupied about them, even as a grade school student. And then when I was 12, and 11, 12, and hormones hit, one of my friends showed me where the Playboy magazines were hidden at the local drugstore, and we started stealing them and stashing them in my garage. We thought we had a secret place, and I asked my dad right before he died whether or not he knew that we had those there, and he said no. It's hard to believe. I mean, they weren't that well hidden, but and we were quite popular with neighborhood boys because we had the lending library, so to speak. Shortly, after that, in my 12th year, I went to one of the many church camps that, of course, I was going to go to and had gone to. And that was the first time that I recall trying to, kind of at a dedication bonfire type service at the end of that camp. I remember trying to, give up the pornography. I wouldn't have known the word pornography. I just, wrote down on a piece of paper a Playboy magazine, and I threw it on the bonfire, and the camp director said, "God will remove all these sins from your life." And I remember clearly being very disappointed when I got back home from the camp and went back down to the drugstore, stole yet another magazine. Did I do something wrong? Did God do something wrong here? Was the camp director wrong? Somebody had to be wrong here. But then I finally decided that since God didn't remove it, or it wasn't gone, that maybe he didn't care all that much. And it was just, a magazine, and it wasn't that big of a deal, and all my friends seemed to like it, and I wanted to fit in, and so I just kept going. I tried to give it up again at that Fellowship of Christian Athletes event where I really dedicated my life to the Lord and to ministry, and I basically said to the Lord, I can distinctly remember that night, if I'm going to go into ministry and be a Christian, then maybe, you should take away this pornography thing that I've been doing. When that didn't happen, I got the message, well, maybe God doesn't care that much, and so I just kept going. I think being raised in a pastor's home, even though my dad, I think, would have said, he never told me, Mark, you need to go into ministry. One of my dad's stories that he told me every birthday was that I remember the day you were born. I remember standing at the window, because back in 1950, they weren't allowed in the delivery room. And the nurse was holding you up, and I remember thinking that God has something special for you to do. Now, my dad would say and claim that he never would describe what that was, just that, I had some special divine calling. Now, today I believe that we all have a divine calling and that we're all called according to God's plan and purpose. But when I was growing up as a kid, I remember desperately kind of wanting to know what that was. And, I certainly wanted to please my father. And my father being a pastor, he would always say things like, ministry is a profession that I would actually pay to do. And he would also say other things like, I would never consider it to be faithful to ask my elder board for a raise or, anything like that. So in other words, ministry is the ultimate thing you do. You would pay to do it. You don't require huge salaries. You just do it. It's God's calling. The only dream I had was to be a professional athlete. I thought that I was going to be a professional tennis player. When I was involved with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, I truly hoped and had a fantasy, I think, that I could be a professional tennis player. And given my talent, it was complete fantasy, you understand. And but I had these hopes and dreams of one of my ones that I always talk about is that I would win the Wimbledon tennis tournament, and when the Queen came down to present the trophy, which she's in fact only done once in her reign. But anyway, the year that I won, the Queen would be there, because obviously I was there. The Queen would want to be there. She would come down and present the trophy, and I would witness to the Queen. That pretty narcissistic, really, when you think about it. But that was really the only dream or fantasy or aspirations that I had. I completely assumed all along, high school, college, that I was just on track to go to seminary and be a pastor just like my dad. Well, I met Deb in high school, and we started dating when I was a freshman in college, and she was obviously and still is the love of my life, and I knew almost right away that this was the woman that I was going to marry. And then back in those days, I don't think any couples, regardless of their Christianity or lack thereof, I don't think many people were being fully sexual. That the sexual revolution hadn't hit quite yet, and so Debbie and I obviously waited until we were married to be sexual, and I just assumed that when we got married, all of the pornography and the masturbation would just go away. I wouldn't be needing to do it anymore. I'd have regular sex with my wife. When in fact, we did get married, and we did have regular sex, and it was fine. There was absolutely no problems with our sexuality. It was enjoyable and all of that. But, for me, unbeknownst to myself, I was fully addicted at that point, and I was literally expecting to be sexual more than is normal, and certainly more than Debbie's, expectations of that. So the result is that I wound up returning first to the masturbation and then eventually to pornography. And I clearly recall there being, incredibly disappointed that, here this was. I'd, prayed a number of times for it to be gone. I'd assumed that, in marriage it would be gone. So now it was back again. And, I was, in that disappointment, lots of shame and all the other kinds of things that actually fuel addiction. Now I'm in seminary and studying to be a pastor. And, my thought back then was if I were to reveal any of this to any of my seminary faculty or my advisor there, who was a brilliant, loving, caring Christian man, that would be the end of my ministry career, which even back then would not have been the case. I think they would have at least tried to talk to me about it. Nobody would have known quite what to do in terms of the addiction. So I remained in silence, and that was, of course, the fuel that Satan always uses to keep us locked in shame and our own loneliness and our own silence. And so therefore, as we progressed in, marriage, because I didn't know any better, there was a part of me that was also growing resentful that, marital sexuality wasn't solving this. And so I think at this point, going back to even age 12, I was angry with God, I was angry with myself, I was angry with Deb. I was just, kind of one angry dude, although I would never have admitted that because I'm a Christian, you don't do that, and I'm going into ministry, and so you got to act, like you're content and whatever. So the result of that was that my addiction just escalated, and I think because of my anger, mainly that allowed me to cross my own Christian beliefs and moral convictions. And as my addiction escalated, then I just started to take notice of all the massive amounts of opportunities that were out there, the women who were willing, the women who were aggressive, those kinds of things. And I started having, sexual encounters of a variety of kinds with, lots of different women. At one point I decided, gee, this is not good in terms of, any potential affair or any of these women becoming dependent on me somehow, and I was totally frightened by that. So I said, maybe just going to see a prostitute at a massage parlor, just getting a massage. I never had the money to pay for full, intercourse or anything like that. Just a massage with, sexual quality to it. And I actually thought, hey, this is not nearly as bad as, these other kind of sexual encounters. So you see, one of the things a sex addict always does is somehow justify. And there were, a ton of days when I would say to myself, if all I do today is masturbate, what a victory that is. Number one, I'm not bugging Deb. Number two, I'm not out there spending too much money. Number three, I'm not looking at pornography because I got all these files of it in my head anyway. And that's just like throwing gasoline on a fire. And I just continued to escalate, and things got worse. It's important to know that because of the abuse that had happened to me early on, there was a part of my spirit that had normalized some of this activity. Even though I knew in my Christian heart that it was wrong, there was a part of me that refused to accept that. Now, having said that, there were times that there was my major advisor in seminary who I dearly loved, and I tried to talk to him about some loneliness and some problems in the marriage that I perceived at that point. And he, of course, talked to me in ways that a Christian counselor would. But the problem was I was not fully confessional in terms of all the sexual things that I was doing. The next time that I really sought some help, I had received my PhD degree and was getting some supervision and counseling from a man who very qualified, a neat guy, a pastor as well as a licensed psychologist. And I revealed to him very early on one of the sexual encounters that I had had, actually with one of the women that I was counseling. So, here is my supervisor. I think he should have intervened on me at that point and told me, I need to stop counseling until I can get some help. But he was a very grace-filled person, and he basically said, we all have those temptations, and but I believe you have enough strength to avoid those temptations, which, in and of itself reveals a lack of understanding of addiction. I mean, if I had enough strength, I wouldn't have done it in the first place. I was completely down the tube. The effect, though, of it was that it was grace-filled, and I interpreted it as such. I ran with that like any addict would do. I just said, well, if we all have those temptations and, it's not that big of a deal and I can keep counseling, and I didn't bring it up with him ever again, even though the behavior continued. In accountability, like we teach on this series, it's like, he should have been asking me, weekly, how are you doing with this kind of temptation? And let me be quick to add, I don't fault him at all. I don't think it was his problem in terms of the state of knowledge that was out there in the field at that time. But there were some things he could have done early on in my career. I was about 27, 28 at this point and I was very early on, and the sexual encounter that I revealed to him was the very first one with a client, and he could have prevented a lot more damage that I did, over really the next 9 to 10 years. But that was not in God's will and plan at that point, and so I continued on, and finally, because that behavior continued, one of the women that I had been involved with reported me more or less, and I was intervened on by my colleagues who were completely disappointed and angry with me for all of this behavior, as they should have been. And there was one man in the room who they'd included at the last minute who was a recovering alcoholic. He was also a physician. And because he was trained and, he was a, medically thinking person and also an alcoholic, so he kind of combined that medical thinking with alcoholic recovery thinking. And he had heard of a treatment center. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd heard of a treatment center for this new concept called sexual addiction. This was back in 1987. The very first book on sexual addiction was published in 1981. So this is like 5 or 6 years later. Not that many people knew about the whole field at that point. But Dr. Polishwood, bless his heart, he knew enough to do some research, and he found out about it. He got the phone number, and he literally came over to my house, and while he didn't quite hold my hand, that's what it felt like he was doing, to get me to make the call and to get assessed by the hospital. And then he made sure that I got on the plane and went to treatment. And that was in March of 1987. So I've been sober since then, and that's the complete and total grace of God that, there in that room that day there were 8 people. 7 of them were so angry with me that it was beyond description. Words like pervert were used, sex offending were used, and stuff like that. And Dr. Polishwood, he stood up at one point and he said, "Mark," he said, "your sins are with sex are no different than mine with alcohol." And the way I put it today, it's the first time I remember. I still get emotional today thinking about it. The first time I remember seeing the face of grace. Somebody who knew the complete story, who was angry about it, but yet at the same point was willing to get me some help because he knew how lost I was. And that was a life-changing moment. One of the female therapist who was actually in that room and was she was the most angry of all of them. She basically said, "You've got to tell your wife, and you've got to tell her like now." And she wasn't going to let me get away with this, slipping and sliding around stuff. So she actually followed me home in her car. And when she walked in the house, she was a very assertive one. In fact, I think she taught assertiveness training back in those days. And so she basically marched into our house, told Debbie to find something for the kids to do or get rid of the kids. We were so numb and shocked at this point that we don't quite fully remember everything that happened. But so Debbie did something to have her business partner take the kids, and we sat down in the living room, and there again, some words like pervert were used, and your husband will probably never be well. And, after about 3 or 4 minutes of this, it's like, "Do you have any questions?" And it's like, Debbie was so shocked. She could not think of any questions, although she had 1,000 questions. She could not think of any to ask this woman who, was not, very gracious or kind or thoughtful. Then when Debbie, had her initial shock and surprise and holy cow and I think some beginning anger, she also felt, I think, there was something in this moment that needed to happen because there was something not quite right between us, and there was an awareness that there was stuff that she didn't know historically, and this kind of I think it made sense to her that this was the missing piece. And I'll never forget her coming over to my chair because I was just I was completely wasted. I was just lost in my sadness and my grief and my shame. And Debbie just said, "We'll get through this, and we'll survive." And that was the second time that day, within the space of an hour, that God showed me the face of grace. One from a man and one from my wife, and that was a transforming day, and gave me the courage to go to treatment. The first 30 days of this whole experience, I was in treatment, so I was around other sex addicts and a staff of people at the hospital who knew how to work with that. So I was around understanding also other broken people that first 30 days, and that was also a way that God was molding my heart to see that there was a community of people. I wasn't alone in this, and that was, I think, one of the most healing parts of treatment. When we got back home from treatment, I think we kept a really low profile. I mean, in terms of friends, we didn't really socialize a whole lot, for really, when I think about it, the next year. But on the other hand, we did have people who were very graceful. And of course, it's one of those proverbial experiences where you find out who your true friends are. They're the ones that are going to show up, whether you've called them or not. They're the ones that are going to extend their grace and their support. We had neighbors who I hadn't talked to hardly at all that came over and said, because eventually my story was in the newspaper and so forth. They came over and told them how much they were supporting me, cared about me. They didn't care what I had done. They were still wanting to be a friend. I had Christian friends that came over and said how much they were praying for us and that kind of thing. So, I mean, it just seemed like, God put into our life, at times when we needed it, people who were kind, supportive, and graceful. We also, there were some tough people too, and that I needed that, because if I'd been able to kind of walk away from this without any of the consequences that I deserved, I'm not sure that I would have taken it as seriously as I did. So I think it's an interesting point, but I think some of the consequences that we experience are also a part of God's grace. It's an interesting thought that consequences are part of God's grace, because it teaches us how to depend on Him, as opposed to ourselves and, that kind of thing. I mean, Debbie and I, we didn't have any clue where we were going to come up with money, and, money showed up occasionally when we most needed it. We had one of our Christian friends come over one day and said, Mark, I was in my daily quiet time this morning, and God put it on my heart that I needed to write you a check, and I don't know why, I don't know what it's for, but here it is. and it was at a time when we really needed that, and so there was just some neat things that happened, and even to this day continue to happen. Our family, my dad and Mom, I think they were in denial and remained so until the day both of them died. They were just, wanting me to still be the hero in the family, and this is no big deal, and, that kind of thing. In fact, I remember one of the things my dad said about this whole thing is that, in my day, this would have been handled very differently. And what I know he meant by that was, well, you'd be moved to another city and told not to do it again, and that would be about it. What we call the geographic cure. That's what my dad was talking about. So he was just wanting me to be normal and wanting to get past it. Deb's parents were very graceful. They were very kind. There was part of that surprised me. I mean, I fully expected my father-in-law particularly to be completely, outraged about this in terms of how he treated his daughter. But my father-in-law is a very graceful man, and he saw, I think, that I was broken and getting help. And I think more than anything, I think we both come from families that believe in marriage and that divorce is not an option. So, they all saw that we were working on stuff and that we were getting through this. And so all around us, I think God provided lots of support. I think there were lots of angry, disappointed people, but they didn't tend to show up. So, they kept their anger to themselves by the grace of God. And occasionally I still get an email from a person who's, angry about what happened. Once in a great while. Maybe once every 5 years I get an email from somebody like that. But by and large, it's all been, very kind. I think it was my third day of treatment when I didn't, completely go willingly to treatment. I was, enough of a still, at that point, a prideful person that, having a PhD in counseling myself, I said we could probably find our own resources and get through this. So, but the third day of treatment, I met a man who had been sober for about a year, and he invited me to go to a 12-step meeting with him that night and to walk with me down to the meeting, which is about a mile away. And so we walked and talked, and I was just so inspired by his serenity that, and the fact that, gee, a year of sobriety is even possible. That's the day I remember feeling hope and feeling glad that I was in treatment and that there was a way out. And I've held on to that ever since. We heal through the sharing of stories, and we find out that we're not alone. So, the first thing I normally do is just tell my own story. I don't necessarily emphasize that I've got 20 years of sobriety, just that, sobriety from the moment that you're aware of this and decide that you want to get well, that, it's possible. I'd like people to know that. And then obviously I work with lots of men on a daily basis, and to be completely honest, I think the first year, you need to be a little tough. I mean, you need to get in their face a little bit and talk about accountability and not messing around and becoming the men that God calls them to be and all of that. So. The counseling center that we operate, I mean, there's any number of men there that have been sober for at least a year. So, I just believe in surrounding people with other hopeful examples of the fact that you can do this. I think one of the great theological or spiritual challenges is to confront your pride. Most of the men that I work with that come to this from a Christian heart, I mean, they're exactly like me. They wanted God to do all the work. They don't want to do any hard work themselves. They don't want to go through any pain. They just want God to come into their brain and remove all this lust. And I think one of the things we have to confront in the early days is how angry some of these people are. And if they can get through that, then there's no reason why they can't be sober.